So I've been working on a long-form Bolsonaro video, and in gathering up various sources and articles and tweets, I've noticed a trend developing among both the radical left and the alt-right, though the radical left seems to be currently the larger culprit. Why is there so much hatred towards people who consider themselves centrists or classical liberals? Here's Margot Pez, the founder of Esther, a Patreon alternative that sees Patreon somehow as far-right, and bills themselves as a progressive lefty alternative. Considering what happened to Subscribestar, I hope nobody with the wrong opinions signs up to your service. I'm not a fan of the centrist fan base Beto has, but I support his call for an end to this unjust system. She's talking about Beto O'Rourke, the center-left option currently filling the Democratic Party's power vacuum after the collapse of the Clinton machine. The fact that he's explicitly not a radical seems to be what Margot's complaining about. And what about Kyle Kulinski on the same topic? Beto apologized to Ted Cruz for saying that Lion Ted was an accurate nickname, and he livestreamed himself at the dentist. Even putting his super centrist voting record aside, I don't think he'll be the Democratic nominee. Why is his centrist voting record a problem? Surely that would mean he has an ability to meet his opponents in the middle and compromise in order to get real work done, right? Here's a tweet from Anarchofac, a disabled trans woman libertarian socialist YouTuber who's trying to spread radical theory. I'm surprised there's no pronouns in that bio. Universities are not full of radical leftists. They're overwhelmingly full of liberal centrists. People on the right are just so reactionary that they mistake the mild progressivism of liberal centrists, such as supporting LGBTQ rights, as radical leftism. I think by your own self-identification, you are not an accurate judge of what is and isn't a radical leftist. And at the expense of exposing myself, and by extension you, as an old person, simply supporting LGBTQ rights is what your average university student did 15 years ago, back when I was at university for the first time. And there were a small minority of religious conservatives, ever shrinking, ever outraged at the on-campus support for the gays. But as I said, that was 15 years back. Canada and the US have since legalized gay marriage. Legal roadblocks for LGBTQ people are either gone or in the process of disappearing. We supported those rights back then because there was a need for legislative change. But now, the activist class was faced with a choice: either shut down and disperse, or lurch ever more radically to the left in order to invent new causes to continually justify their existence. And whenever you lurch more left, centrists start to look an awful lot like the far right that you hate. I've had those 3 tweets linked to me by viewers of the channel, but just for fun's sake, let's do a quick scroll through the use of the word centrist on Twitter right now and see what we can find. Pretty cool how the only way this shutdown doesn't end with the complete political annihilation of Trump and the Republican Party is if a lazy, corporate, centrist media skews the narrative into somehow being the Democrats' fault for not compromising, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The media has been lurching left along with the SJWs, but I guess since they're not keeping pace, they're centrist now, eh? I only take criticism from Marxist feminists. I truly don't give a fuck about some centrist liberal's opinion, especially not through CC. After all, liberals get the bullet too. This isn't fact-checking, it's a weird centrist mind exercise. This is in response to a fact-check of a recent Donald Trump speech. It wasn't all good for Trump, but it was worse for the Dems. As it turns out, pesky things like truth and facts qualify as a weird centrist mind exercise. Responsible centrist. What about apartheid? The fact that you would compare border security in the face of violent militant cartels to apartheid simply because a wall is involved, and that you would somehow pin that insane Fantasyland justification on centrists is mind-boggling to me. But it's not just Twitter nobodies that hold this view of politics. Like I said earlier, the media's radicalized itself leftward as well, and the demonization of centrists can be seen in some of the rhetoric they push. For example, in the 2016 election cycle HuffPo article, more evidence that centrist solutions can't save us. The presumed presidential nominee of the Democratic Party is expected to embrace standard Democratic initiatives like raising the minimum wage, investing in infrastructure, closing corporate tax loopholes, and cutting taxes for the middle class, along with newer ideas like providing incentives to corporations to increase profit sharing with employees, and changing labor laws to give workers more collective bargaining power. These ideas, while worthwhile, will not reverse our multi-decade descent into equality. Nor does it seem likely that the philosophy of Hillary Clinton's advisors will resonate with the voters who have lost so much ground during this process of decline. They call it inclusive capitalism, and that's a formulation which would not have been out of place in conservative Republican platforms of recent decades. Do you see what this guy's saying? Inclusive capitalism, meaning capitalism with a safety net and a mechanism to get the poorest of the poor on the board, like a healthcare system or a student loan system, is not radical enough change. To me, that's about as far as we should be going, but that's why centrists are demonized. If it's not radicalism, it's simply a waste of time. But not only is centrism considered a counter-revolutionary force, it's also a pie-in-the-sky idea that will never actually exist, apparently. Stop whining, centrists. Bipartisanship is a myth that never existed. Everything is an eternal revolutionary struggle, comrade. All hierarchies are corrupt with power. All relations between individuals or group are always a form of combat. The difference between 2013 and 1963 is that in the earlier period, liberals and conservatives were found in both of the two parties, which still reflected the geographic realignment that had produced the Civil War. The Democrats, still based in the South, had their conservative Southern and Midwestern members, while the Republicans, still the Northern Party of Lincoln, had many liberal members. So both parties had traditionally conservative and liberal wings, and likely were able to come together on multiple issues in the past. Isn't that the very nature of bipartisanship? Politics is civil war by bloodless means, ballots rather than bullets. For one side to win, the other side has to lose. And for one side to win, it needs to mobilize enough support to roll over a bitter and determined opposition if necessary. This is the analysis of somebody unwilling to compromise. If you don't give an inch, then yes, either you steamroll your opponent, or you get steamrolled yourself. But it only has to be that way if you are stupidly, suicidally stubborn. Take the current government shutdown over the funding of the wall, for example. What if the Democrats actually decided to stop being petulant children and presented Trump with a deal? Something like, say, we'll give you the wall if you give us Obamacare. That would be actual compromise, not one side simply crushing the other. Each party would walk away with something that they want, something they can show to their constituents and say, look, we can actually get work done sometimes. But if you come from the postmodernist school of thought where everything boils down to a simple power struggle, it's no surprise that you think centrists and their silly ideas like compromises are unrealistic. Another core tenet of centrism, horseshoe theory, that the radical left and the radical right have more in common with each other than they do with the center left and center right, is also, predictably, something that the media has in its sights. And, just as predictably, they describe it as the tool of fascists. Let's put an end to horseshoe theory once and for all. Accusing the left of fascism only helps the real fascists. Well, no, I wouldn't accuse the radical left of being fascists. I'd accuse them of being tyrants. Fascism is a form of tyranny unique to the right, but that doesn't mean that the left can't also be tyrannical. For centrists, and for right-wingers, horseshoe theory is a convenient chunk of heavy iron to toss in the faces of left-wing opponents. But its very convenience should be treated with suspicion. Everyone loves to hate the left, but hating the left isn't a good way to fight right-wing extremism. On the contrary, the conflation of alt-right Nazis with a supposed alt-left gives people like President Donald Trump and former Breitbart chairman Steve Bannon rhetorical cover to slime their critics as the real fascists. Perhaps even worse, claiming that the left is especially prone to fascist tendencies allows folks on other parts of the political spectrum to ignore their own complicity when actual fascism crawls out of the mud. And here is the core problem. Actual fascism has not yet crawled out of the mud, and your hyperbole does not make it so. Trump, for all of his faults, is not a fascist. Bolsonaro, for everything he's done since taking office, and we will talk about that on the channel soon too, is still not a fascist. Steve Bannon is not a fascist. Politicians that you disagree with are not simply fascists. For example, people called Brett Kavanaugh a fascist back during the nomination. Nobody on the left cared that it was a grossly inaccurate statement. Nobody cared that Kavanaugh considered, for example, Roe versus Wade to be a settled matter. He was just a fascist because all people that aren't radical lefties are fascists. And that was that. As anybody with a brain could have predicted, Kavanaugh's actions since the confirmation have been characteristic of your average center-right conservative. But should you bring his name up to an SJW, they'd act like he's been personally leading right-wing death squads every day since he took his seat on the court. The real reason the radical left demonizes centrists as being part of the radical right, and vice versa, I might add, is because when viewing reasonable centrist positions through their ideological lens, they see opposing stripes of radicalism. Here's one final example. It's good that Dan Hodges is a centrist and would never push a far-right agenda. The poster is being sarcastic, and he includes 3 Dan Hodges quotes that he sees as far-right as a way to discredit the idea of centrism. The quotes read, "Today the government has announced the latest measures to tackle what it will describe as the ISIL terror threat." ISIL is a code word, it actually means Muslims. Last week, the nation was confronted with the graphic, grotesque horror of the Rotherham child rape cases. They had, we were told, been perpetuated by Asian sex gangs. In this case, the code word was Asian. They were, in fact, Muslim sex gangs. It was only a relatively small number of men responsible for the Rotherham rapes, but it was the Muslim community as a whole that created the environment that allowed the abuse to continue. There's not too much that's factually wrong with these statements. Maybe the first one is a stretch, equating ISIS with all Muslims, but the other two are spot on, 100% accurate. However, one of the radical left's core tenets right now is Islamic apologia. When anybody is not willing to be an Islamic apologist, if instead they recognize the danger that Islam poses to the kafir, the non-believer, if instead they want individual Muslims held accountable for their repulsive actions, even if those actions are permitted under Sharia law, the radical left sees them not as a rational centrist, but as a fascist, a Nazi, a member of the dreaded alt-right. But that's not how the world works. The core ideology of the left has shifted so far into the territory of radicalism that to them, all centrists look like the far right. And so the very concept of centrism itself becomes a joke in their eyes. They see no centrists, only Nazis. And when somebody proclaims themselves to be a centrist in their own defense, they simply view the word as a synonym for Nazi. There can be no compromise with these Nazis in centrist clothing. The only option left on the table is war. And while it's a war that the radical left will never win as they continue to radicalize even further and leave large swaths of the voting populace behind in their wake, it's also a war that none of us will ever win. What we all understand to be compromise in order to find the best possible solution, they view as an immoral collaboration with a hated enemy. The increasing demonization of the centrist is just a symptom of the radical left's, and the religious rights before it, unwillingness to compromise with those they see as tainted, impure, unclean. And unfortunately for society, that's almost everybody. As long as the left is unwilling to put aside its unending brinkmanship, come to the table and hammer out an agreement that nobody likes, everybody can live with, and allows the government to get some real work done, we are all going to suffer.